is Bee Rowlatt's beautiful book. This is her beautiful book. And
Bee has your book.
Bee has
And
my
this
book.
is Namita's beautiful book, The Blind
And of
Matriarch, and they're all on sale right next door.
Exactly. That's what I was leading to. Bee Rowlatt's passionate and engaged biography of Mary Wollstonecraft follows her journey as a writer, philosopher, and visionary advocate of women's rights. Gwendoline Riley's recent My Phantoms has been described as devastating, quietly brutal novel, whereas I don't think it's quietly brutal. I think it's quietly tender, so more on that later. Where Bridget, a 40-something academic, faces her ghosts as she examines her relationship with her mother Helen. As for me, little humble bragging, my 20th book, The Blind Matriarch, is set in the heart of an Indian joint family in the times of the pandemic. Interestingly, the book of the season for Indian books is Gitanjali Shree's Hindi novel, which won the International Booker Prize this year. It's also about a mother and a daughter and their changing and evolving relationships as the mother breaks out across borders and boundaries to return to the past she had left behind during the partition of India. Don't forget, all women are daughters too, Gitanjali Shree comments. And that book, I found so many resonances and so many interactions with my own book, just as I did in her book. So on that note, I'd like to turn to Gwendoline and this brilliant, truly brilliant and truly unsettling novel, My Phantoms. Tell us about your book, about Bridget and Helen, about mothers and daughters. You've said in an interview, if you do not want scrutiny, you should not have children. Children look at their parents and want to ask questions. They want to know why. Tell us about that.
Okay, so my book is written from the perspective of a 40-something academic called Bridget. And she's writing about her mother. She tells her mother's life story, really, from birth to death. And these two women, through no fault of their own, find themselves mother and daughter. And the relationship is hostile and needling and often very distant. But not quite distant. They do keep coming back together. So I have a whole section where they're meeting once a year for a birthday meal, which is very hard work for both of them. So I realized, having written quite a lot of the book, I realized what I'd done was to set up in opposition somebody who had a very happy childhood, followed by a life where everything went wrong. That's the mother. And her daughter, who had a rather miserable childhood, followed by a life where everything went right. So that's sort of what they've got against each other. The mother's was born abroad as an expat in Venezuela. Her father had been a Spitfire pilot, so that was very glamorous. And the expat upbringing with the colony club and the swimming pool and the tennis was very glamorous. And she was this doted-on child who was told she was beautiful and clever. Only back in England, things didn't quite pan out. And again, she was a teenager in London a late teenager at college in London in the 60s, when, again, should be exciting, new freedoms. And yet again, things don't quite pan out for the mother. Before you know it, she's in that old situation of being married to an authoritarian husband and with two kids she didn't really want. So that's her situation. The life has been disappointment and being thwarted. And her daughter, almost holds this against her, and is tormented by her mother's constant rattling. I would say she's sort of rattling the handle on life. So her mother keeps wondering, as an adult, why aren't I still admired? Why aren't I still the prettiest and the cleverest? Why aren't things working out for me? And the daughter kind of wants her to, expectation management. The daughter wants her to adjust her expectations of life, and the mother refuses. And so this causes some tension. I suppose that's setting that up.
Well, it's a book that most mothers would react to in recognizing some bits of it. I don't know about the fathers in the audience, whether they would recognize their wives or their sisters or There are people in it. But when after I read this book, something strange happened to me. I completely lost my nerve before my own daughter. Because, you know, there is a way daughters talk to their mothers. And every time she'd roll her eyes at something I said,
Yes.
which daughters do, you know, I thought I could get, I'm a very impressionable reader, and I could get Helen's voice inside me making some prattling, some stupid conversation just to fill up the air, because I'm so terrified that I have to say something to my daughter. And actually I have a reasonably good relationship with my daughters, and they would find it extremely sort of transactional of me to use their distinguished personalities to talk about. But I did find myself sounding sort of sillier than usual, because I thought that she was thinking of me the way Bridget was thinking of her mother.
Yeah, I mean, it's terrible what happens between these two women. They sort of both end up incredibly on the back foot, or, you know, ready to go with the other one.
And meaning well from the beginning.
I think so, yeah.
So
I think so.
What surprised me in the book was a lot of the reviews I read seemed to think that the daughter was cruel or uncaring, and that you yourself were cruel and uncaring also.
That's
and that it was a brutal sort of a book.
Yeah.
Whereas I saw it differently. I saw the mother anxious always about her daughter, as she's anxious about many things, and uncertain about herself in front of her vastly more confident daughter from a different generation, and as you said, who's managed her life better. But in the girl, in the daughter, what I saw was a terror. Every young girl I know has a terror of growing into her mother. You know, it's a real thing, and I see it in my mom, and I mean, me with my mother. I mean, it's not I'm trying to say that the relationship between a daughter and a mother is not always a rational relationship.
It's not. I wanted to slightly to universalise it, though, to expand on Gitanjali Shree's comment that every woman is a daughter, every human has a mother. And I think perhaps there's almost a Rorschach test about the way people responded to your book, because everyone does have that older parent that you want to love, you want to show love to, but just they're so annoying. And so no matter how hard you try, and so some of the very excruciating, I mean, I just squirmed in some of those birthday dinners, because, you know, I think anybody can experience that sense of just resentment about the expectations of the care obligations and filial obligations, regardless of gender. You know, that cuts across. That's something that's very commonly experienced.
I think the Rorschach test is a very good way of putting it, because reactions were quite extreme, and I think you can make a case either way, that this person's cruel, that the daughter's cruel, that the mother's cruel, that both of them are trying hard, that they're not exceptional, most mums are like this, or that there's really something deeply strange going on with this mother. I think you can sort of, you know, turn it to the light this way or that and make the case either way. I hope that's how it's worked out. I think that's what makes
a brilliant book, isn't it?
Well, brilliant, but I think that's the sign of a good book, where it's not just X, Y, Z, this black and white, I suppose. Yeah.
Because for me, what I found was a tremendous tenderness, but a very in the daughter, but a tenderness she would never admit to.
Well, I think the thing in poetry or drama, I think, or like lyric poetry anyway, and dream plays, that kind of thing, there is this convention of opening a space where someone can address somebody directly, somebody who's dead or somebody who's lost or gone, and say things in a way that is more meaningful or accurate than you can in real life. And I sort of want to do the exact opposite of that in my book. They can't say things that are meaningful and accurate, and neither of them really want to. It would be horrifying for either of them to hear what the other one really wanted to say or felt. So it was a very hard needle to thread to sort of write those conversations that sort of go round in circles and where they don't get to the point and where they're niggling each other. And you want to do it to a point that's exasperating for the reader, but not too exasperating, where they're like, how much more of this is there? So it was quite interesting as a technical challenge to just write enough conversations to give this sense of, you know, as I say, rancor and not quite getting to the point.
Well, one of the
without
great
it being-
tensions in it are the things that are unsaid. So
Yes.
exactly those spaces that you've left. So, the main character, oh God, what's her name again?
Bridget.
Bridget will brightly say, "Oh dear." And she doesn't say any more than that, but you know there's a whole lot more going on than that. And then her mum completely livens up when someone in her acro aerobics class dies. That's her most cheerful.
Yes.
But again, it's unbelievably restrained. It's so restrained because most of it's being left unsaid.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sort of volcanic undercurrent. It's
I will.
quite terrifying.
It's been suggested I do a quick reading, and I will.
Just to give a sense of.
I won't give a sense of that because that would involve me doing some acting, which I can't do. So this is just the daughter thinking about her mother. I can't know what my mother was like at work. It's still hard to imagine or guess. She maintained that she hated her job. Everybody hates their job, Bridge, she used to say. Everybody does. Later, after she'd retired, she told me that going into the office used to make her feel sick. Absolutely sick to my stomach, yes. Why? I asked. It just wasn't me, she said, frowning. It was the same with where we lived. That wasn't her either. She just wasn't a suburbs person, she used to say with a shake of her head. Still, there she was, in the house with the dark bay window, with the hydrangea bush by the bins. That what my mother did or had done was what everybody did or what people did was sovereign, that it was normal. She would pronounce that word with urgent emphasis. Other considerations did not get much room. Her antipathy to her circumstances was no spur to change. I think it was the opposite in a way back then. My mother loved rules. She loved rules and codes and fixed expectations. I want to say, as a dog loves an airborne stick. Here was unleashed purpose and freedom of a sort. Here, too, was the comfort of the crowd and of joining in, of not feeling alone and in the wrong.
It's beautiful. So, now,
Me?
you, and maybe you begin with a reading.
So,
because
shall I? Well, Screeching Gear Change. So mine, the book that I'm talking about is a work of non-fiction. It's called In Search of Mary. It's inspired by the life of an 18th century philosopher, Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a woman of great significance to every human on earth, as far as I'm concerned, because she was one of the early architects, not just of feminism, but of human rights itself. She was a really, really important thinker. Who had a pretty sensational life, but until recently has been very little known in our history because patriarchy. So I set about writing a book sort of inspired by a journey that she underwent in 1795. And the idea was to look at her legacy, explore her legacy, try to live some of it, and also kind of lower the bar to entry to Mary Wollstonecraft, feminist, Enlightenment philosopher, and just make her a bit more kind of easy breezy. So it was something that I added on to this, as you can tell from the cover. Mary Wollstonecraft undertook this 1795 journey with a toddler, with her quote-unquote illegitimate child, and she was off on a treasure hunt around the rocky coasts of the Skagerrak, which is pretty rock star nowadays, let alone in 1795. And I retraced that journey with my then smallest kid, who was the same size as her kid, which gave me ample opportunity to reflect on injustices. And so I'm going to read a little rant from that. And it's the reason I've picked this extract is that to me it speaks to some of the kind of matriarchal lineages that this session has been set up to. So I envisaged the women that had come before me in my particular.
and you chose her as your foremother.
I chose her as my literary foremother. In this sense, so my understanding of foremothers is that there's our actual foremothers, the people that birthed the people that birthed the people, and so on, that lived through things in order to get to our lives. And I'm quite preoccupied with that in a political sense. And then, which I hope we'll get to later, also our literary foremothers, the writers to whom we turn, and how their literary sort of gene pool has trickled down to us. I'm in the first camp with this one. And it's about sort of mum rage, really. I sat down to write in this vein, inhaling the indignation alongside furious detractors and lid lifters. I hadn't even advanced to the pay gap. My principal motivation was seeing that working mothers still do all the laundry. How to battle the constant interruptions and the splintering of time, concentration, and even your very own self. I squinted back with the distillation of raggy hindsight into my teenage years. All those breezy assumptions about equality and worlds being oysters. How did they harden into resentment? Running headfirst into motherhood, that's how. I was a slow and reluctant adapter to the landscape of parenting, unwilling to acknowledge that the alien force known as babies can mark a profound change in women's lives. After having 4 of them, I'm still catching up with that identity split. Resentment. Resentment makes you say things like, your problem is you're too selfish to pick the towel up off the floor, and now you're doing it just to annoy me. You shout this while your partner looks around for a towel that he wasn't even sure existed. He doesn't know, and neither perhaps do you, that it may have taken a decade to build up the resentment centered on this towel, or several centuries if you count the simmering convoy of your female ancestors. There they are, glowering at the forlorn towel on the floor, grinding their medieval teeth. Thank you.
So I'd like to move to this larger canvas of women's rights, responsibilities in the context of your important biography. And I don't want to keep interrupting with questions, so I also want you to tell us about the next book.
Oh.
And where you think these themes pick up with.
Well, so I've just handed in my next work, which is a work of fiction. And I only realised this morning, while thinking about this panel, that the protagonist, a 15-year-old girl with some very interesting behaviour traits, doesn't have a mum. And I suddenly thought, oh gosh, that's meaningful. I'm still not quite sure why. But suddenly the character from my future book kind of leapt into this panel somehow. But yes, this one's only just gone to my agent, so I'm really at that kind of awkward phase of not being at all articulate on that
Mary
front.
Wollstonecraft defied the conventions of marriage, monogamy and child rearing, yet she did the nurturing role of the mother quite deeply, in the sense that she nursed her own mother through long suffering. She also tended to her sister, to her friends like Fanny Blood. Tell us about this sort of disconnect between the nurturing of a woman's of her life and also her lack of getting restraint.
Well, in the abstract, it's interesting.
And just to so that we can enjoy.
I don't know how much to sort of tether this onto to Mary Wollstonecraft, who's a really very extraordinary figure, and I could talk about her at length. But I'd also like to just look at the idea of what we mean when we say that someone's a carer, because you can still, generally speaking, as a woman, dodge the bullet of kids and still end up being a carer, and lots of my friends are in that situation.
Yes.
So,
but why are women?
It catches up with you one way or another, and that's why are the women doing?
But why are the women more the carers than the men? Is that so you think, or do you think?
I think it is so, but I really don't know why. Why, Gwendoline? Does anybody know why? Of course, there are caring men. I think it's not encouraged in men and boys.
I have a brother who looks after my mother, so I'm out of this conversation.
Hello.
Do you want to make a longish comment? In which case, we can give you a mic for a second.
Yeah, I do create writing, and I'm doing my short stories. I do my own creation of short stories, like the soap operas, like Coronation Street, EastEnders, Emmerdale, and Hollyoaks.
But
I make up fictional characters.
so does that have anything to do with our conversation?
Something similar like that. I make up.
Can we talk about that afterwards? Because if it was a direct comment on this, later in the conversation, lead to the
Thanks.
So I'll tell you about my book as well, so that we can move on to a more general conversation. This book of mine, it's about an old woman who I wrote it just before the pandemic, and it began with an image of an old woman who is blind and lives in the top story of an old house in New Delhi. It came out of literally nowhere. But it obsessed me until I had to drop all the other things. The day the Jaipur Literature Festival got over, and even before I was promoting the book I was doing, I just began writing this story, and I wrote it in real time during the pandemic. And then when the pandemic was over, my publishers published it a little later because the book publishing industry had closed down at that time. And I thought, who would want to read about this old woman and her very boring life? Because all she really did was make some laddus and hang around at home and have children who were squabbling a bit. There was no, of course, the storyline of the pandemic was there. And then I discovered...
Really sorry, we're not hearing you very well.
Your mic's still on. Your mic.
I'm going to give you a hand.
Thank you.
That would be better.
This is not working for you with your output.
So how much of my conversation did anybody hear?
We did.
You did? Do I rewind? So I wasn't at all sure whether this book would get any traction. But I found that everybody in India had a grandmother, a lost grandparent. It's very important in our world. And so it's in that sense a little different from her book or even your book. Matangi Ma became an image of Mother India almost. This single image of an old woman, a blind woman living on top floor of a family home. And there is, India, all the stories tend to come out of myth. And somewhere she resonated with Queen Gandhari, who was the mother of 100 sons, and her self-imposed blindness. But the idea of a blind woman, to quote Toni Morrison from her Nobel lecture, she said, once upon a time there was an old woman, blind but wise. Or was it an old man, a guru perhaps, or a griot soothing restless children? I've heard the story of one exactly like this in the lore of several cultures. So it was about a blind woman, and I don't know where it came from, but it was of a different sort of isolation. But the isolation, the social differences, the cultural differences in the role of home and family, of the mother figure, between India and Asia, here in the UK and where we come from, are different. Bee, you have lived in Delhi and observed the very different family structures. The core of love, the parental bond is very out there. I'm sure it's no different, but the process of weaning, of individuation is lacking, and boys remain little boys all their lives, and daughters. It's a different sort of a bond. I was wondering if you think it's a different sort of bond, or whether the parents are the same everywhere.
I think it is very different. I mean, South Asian parents, South Asian mums, you know, very famously tiger mums, and very famously the sort of centre of gravity. And what you've represented in the Blind Matriarch is a beautiful representation of that sort of joint family, the families within families, all stacked up together in the same space. But Matangi Ma herself reflects. She looks into nature and says, you know, but every bird does fly the nest. You know, should that be happening? She thinks about that with regard to her own family. And I think here, or certainly in Western cultures, we are much more prone to fly the nest. You leave home and you don't look back.
But do you think that the Asian families here fly their nest differently? Because I was listening to Anita Rani yesterday, and the family structures seem different across communities. What is your observation there?
That's not for me to comment on how South Asian family. I mean, it must be quite a tricky one still belonging. I can see some nods of recognition for people from that heritage who live in this country, because clearly you're between.
No, not yet.
Yeah. Did you want to say?
Yes.
Okay. But what's interesting, and I have to say yours was the first COVID literature, not that that's necessarily its only genre, but it was the first book that I've read about lockdown, because I wasn't really ready to go back into it. But it brought back that sense of distillation, of people being reduced to the very closest family, the very closest people that there were, and deep reflection on that. So everybody in lockdown was, in that sense, distilled into a very small version of the family. So we all became a bit South Asian, I think,
so
in lockdown,
if your book
whether
was,
we wanted to or not.
So if your book was written during the pandemic, do you see the family coming closer together or remaining much the same?
Oh.
Just the way they came together when the mother fell ill. A different set of bonds and obligations came in there.
That's true, but this is requiring me to speculate as if they're real people. I don't know. No, I think the compassion would have won out for this. The mother in the book, who's quite so alone. I think thinking of her truly on her own and without all the distractions that she has to keep whirling all around her in order to not feel dead inside. I think if my characters were real people, then they would certainly have had to rally round a little bit more than they managed to in normal times in the novel. Yeah.
But can I pick up you mentioned the theme of resentment, and it's one that I quite enjoy. The sort of spiky, passive-aggressive resentment, very British thing. I just wonder whether there's a real, whether it's valid to look at just the data around ages. You make the point that India is a very young country. It's full of young people. It's upwardly mobile, it's optimistic, it's just full of youth. And that's just not the case here. Britain's old. I mean, we probably should start calling it England, is old and tired and confused, which has led to all sorts of strange life choices lately in terms of our voting. And, young people, I think, are kind of looking and thinking, well, that's not the social contract I entered into. Stop talking about how you could buy a house for 20 quid in the 1970s. And so probably there is resentment boiling that might not be the case in South Asian, more younger countries. I'm completely speculating, but I do think that resentment is something we should probably be on the lookout for increasingly in intergenerational terms in this country.
Yep, that's good. The generations are going to go to war.
Yeah, fight club, intergenerational fight club. But not in Matangimar's household.
But when young people are writing novels, do you think they're writing out the previous generation, or are they still looking intergenerationally? I mean, I know that's a very difficult, because a very general question, but do you see older people in younger people's novels or fiction, or do they pretty much exist?
That's an interesting one. See, one of my preoccupations is the literature that came before, and not that I want to write the same as my literary foremothers, but their existence is incredibly important to me, and it's something I think about a lot. But as to whether that's the case for younger writers, I suspect probably not, which is exciting.
Because you're a younger writer, but
It's all relative. I'm not that young.
No, but what I'm trying to say is that you've looked back as well. And lots of writers of your generation
Oh yes, absolutely.
do not look back.
Do they not? I don't know. I almost never read writers younger than me.
I've been reading for a few. I've been reading for some prize juries, so that's where this observation comes from. Because I have been reading a lot of literature out of the UK and from other countries, and India, of course, we are going back to myth and all the mythic mothers, and I mean the mother is very much a central figure in Indian literature and Asian literature and the foremother, but most of the books seem to be more self-obsessed about the here and the now, which is good. I mean, but
yeah, I honestly, I really don't. Not on principle, just because I don't like spending money, and so I really read the books that are already in our flat. But you're right. Recently, I did an event about this book by Elizabeth Taylor called Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont, which is about a woman who's sort of been cast off by her own daughter and has to go and live in a hotel. It was written in the 60s, but during the discussion, we sort of said, oh, what other books can we think of that are about people of this generation? Lots of them. And we couldn't come up with any.
Oh, really?
I mean, there's books that are mixtures, but ones where all the characters are of that age. Yeah. We were really quite stumped.
The thing is, to be a writer, you have to be a reader. You have to be a reader, and you have to love books. You just have to. Mm-hmm. So you can't just spring fully fledged from the head of Zeus and, I don't think you can. Maybe someone can, but I just think it's extremely unlikely. So there is always a debt. There is always a gratitude, whether you can kind of brazen it out or not, that it has to come from somewhere.
so in a literary space, of course, the foremothers are there.
Yeah.
But in a social space, sometimes it's just each generation for themselves. Mm-hmm. I think more than us struggling to hold this theme together, which is a very scattered
I quite like
theme.
that it's too big, though, and
I-
it's kind
I
of
think-
spilling out. It's it's
but
a huge theme.
what I would love is just one or two people from the audience, if they'd want to tell us about their intergenerational reading and experiences, and we could come back to us if you think that's, I mean, does anybody like to tell us? There's somebody. Could you have a mic?
I'll just answer your question first, because you were asking about Indians in India today and the Indians here. I spend equal amount of time in India and the UK, and I also run a charity for the elderly, so I interact a great deal.
A charity for the elderly
for the
here
elderly,
or there?
both, 4 cities here and 39 in India. So we get a lot of this. I'll go back to what Bee said. I think the bond is the same whether an Indian family lives in India or abroad. They just don't let go. And I'll speak for myself as a mother as well as a daughter. We just don't let go. We do it differently because there is, for the youth who grew up outside India, like even for the youth in India today, there is personal space which sort of didn't exist when we grew up because there was no concept of personal space in India at all. So obviously the need for personal space, the need to not make a call, not to meet, but send a message, and all of that is very, very similar to youth across the world. But at the same time, the obsession with children's success, whether Indians grow or live in India or outside India, remains the same. And which is why the matriarch, like you described, would, like your matriarch in New Delhi, like Matangi Ma, would probably be dreaming of her children or her grandchildren, I'm assuming, and their success, even though they don't live with her. So that's the first question to be answered. Second is this generational of women, which we spoke about. I think it's amazing how our journeys began from something not just Gandhari, like you mentioned, the blind queen, but other women who brought up children in India. Because in the joint family that you're describing, there's always more than one mother. There's an aunt, there is a grandmother, there's someone else who is, you learn cooking from one person, and then you hear about the Mahabharata stories from another person, and philosophy from a third, and ambition and professional success from a fourth. So there is always going to be these influences which unfortunately don't exist among the Indians in India or here.
That's, I think, a very valid point, just because it is true that we grow up, I mean, one of the themes of my book is the joint family as against the individuated family here. And the joys of the terrors, insecurities and joys of the joint family are quite different, more like a commune almost, or communal living. And there is somebody who wanted to add to her comments here.
I could just, while you're getting the mic, I'd love to pick up on that point, because I do think that motherhood is very differently viewed and celebrated in India, in my experience and how I witnessed it. And I remember at one point travelling to this extraordinary place, Guwahati in Assam, and going to a temple, and it was the temple of Kamakya, the mother goddess, and there they have a festival that celebrates her menstruation, and I actually thought, they're teasing me because I'm a gullible white woman. Is it actually possible? Because the menstruation taboo is universal, and we dipped our hands in the menstrual blood of the goddess, and I just thought, I was absolutely blown away by that there was something so celebratory, indeed sort of elevated, around the motherhood goddess, that was astounding to me.
We don't do that anymore, but unfortunately I've seen some of that being done here by some Indian communities.
But what do we not do? Of course they dip
The ceremony of...
No, she's talking about the Kamakya temple.
Yes,
In the Kamakya temple.
It was in the temple, yes.
And I think that menstrual ceremony was actually a ceremony that did make sense, because if it sort of taught a young girl about menstruation in a sort of as clinical a way as that was.
I thought it was. I was blown away. I mean, white people only go to India for two reasons, historically, either to steal everything or to, be enlightened. I was very firmly in the second camp on that one. And, through your other books as well, Namita, learning about Shakti, the divine female, and the goddesses that you've written about, has been a real eye-opener. Anyway, sorry, I just wanted to cover that patch.
I think sometimes, I don't know if it's...
You tell us your name.
Oh, my name is Shafali Frost. I'm a musician and a poet. So, but I find that a lot of us, and I'm not, it's not just Indians, maybe it's a South Asian thing, but we have a very middle class view of looking at things. So what you might hear might not be really true of someone from the village who's traveled from Bundelkhand village to live in a shanty town in Delhi. Her relationship with her daughter will be so completely different. Very often, because in our culture, I hate the word our culture, in places in the world, literacy and being able to articulate history go hand in hand. But the second thing that I would really like to say is that I don't know if culture can be so divided into geography, except as much as in this country, for at least 3 or 4 generations, we've had the wonderful welfare state. So where parents are not really dependent upon their children to take them to the hospital. If you're unwell, they're not there holding the glucose saline bags and running from blood bank to blood bank. There is greater expectation from the state and from the society to look after the elderly. And hence, what could be seen in a certain light as well celebration of motherhood or celebration of old age can also be this great need to hold a unit together as a mode of survival.
Absolutely.
So and also this whole idea of us being women and celebrating womanhood, I think a lot of us in all parts of the world and also India and Pakistan are trying to run out of that sort of glorification. We don't want to be glorified as mothers. We want to be ordinary human beings who fail, who are made for other things.
But I'd like to respond before somebody else wants to pick up the thing. But what I would like to say is that, do you live in India or do you live here?
Both.
So what I've observed when you said that there are people in homes where they don't have a privilege and advantage, I'd say even those women work very, very hard, not only women but parents, to pass on their, some level of education and advantage to their children so they get it. So I'd say that is that form of dedication. So I'd say that the family unit in India does hold together even now, generally, much more, I won't say cohesively or necessarily, whatever. But the process of individuation becomes more difficult for the person who wants to break out because of the demands or needs or hopes of the family. There was somebody there who wanted to continue this conversation. Do tell us your name.
I'm Jayanti. I just find that, just restricting it to South Asians, is there, I see glimpses of it in a lot of cultures. The southern Italian culture, for example, the matriarchy, the strong matriarchy, even though the Mediterranean men stereotype is the machismo and all that, but there's that sort of contradiction where you have the strong matriarch, and where some of my friends have married into Italian, and they said we were expecting the differences, but we didn't expect the similarities. We were taken aback by the similarity. And also, for example, something like in Spain, there was actually a beach we went to. It was, no British there, completely local beach. It was called Playa de Regla, which is the whole beach was named after menstruation. And initially it was very uncomfortable, but then, I thought this is great. They're celebrating and they're in awe of.
I think,
introduce
hi,
yourself,
sorry,
please.
my name's Jigdeep. I'm second generation here, so I think having been born and brought up here, I think culturally, people who emigrate, there's a great pressure on them of wanting to carry on their culture. So the vast majority of teaching me my culture fell to my mother, and I think that's the case that's very true for a lot of immigrants. And so hence, the South Asian community or whatever community, it's about the mothers trying to hold on to that culture. And that I grew up in a joint family. So
here or
here.
in India?
And so the pressure was, not so much the pressure, but it was my mother and the other women in my family wanting for us to learn about our culture because our fathers were off out earning or whatever because they were first generation immigrants. So I think there's it's dependent on the generation, and it's dependent on the circumstances.
Please do give her the mic, but somehow we seem to be generalizing a lot because there are women who walk alone in South Asia and anywhere. And there are women who stay at home, and there are women who are, I mean, the three points of view are fiction and our biography and my whatever it is hold together are of course very different. So I was hoping that the audience viewpoints will.
Well, there's a question, and Ruth had a question.
I just wanted to your comment. Being born here, I think there's a.
Your name?
Oh, my name's Deepa. Thank you all. Just thinking about that preservation of culture and identity. I think being the third. I was brought up with a very strong sense of third daughter. And my mother wasn't even born in India, she was born in Nairobi, so product of empire and all of that. But that kind of, three daughters, and being brought up with that. And so being brought up to speak Hindi, Sindhi, Punjabi, growing up with Indian culture, going to the Saturday classes at the temple, that kind of, to your point about growing up with this sense of preservation of culture, and then the juxtaposition of growing up British, whereby I moved out as soon as I could. But from a community perspective, you're meant to get married and you're meant to leave. Being single in my 30s or being single now I'm in my 40s, that kind of community. And the struggle for my mother to then say, but she's moved out because of work. I didn't move out because of work. I moved out because there's no chance I was going to be in my late 20s and living at home. And that was growing up as a British independent and independently minded, but that kind of the conflict of preservation and it's not done versus, I'm going to live my life because I'm born here, love.
Ruth?
Hello, thank you, Ruth Patel. I'm thinking about the relation between the literary foremothers and mothers and daughters that we all have today in different continents. And I wondered what you all thought about the fact that some of our most important fictional literary foremothers in this country were childless and daughterless. That is, Jane Austen, the Brontes, Virginia Woolf. And I wondered if there are parallels there with great women Indian foremothers whom we would look back to.
Yes, indeed. Gitanjali Sri who's won the Booker International Prize, and I was in conversation with her yesterday, and her foremother, who she declares and who she dedicates the book to, is Krishna Sopti, who was not married and who did not have children. There was Mahadevi Varma. In fact, I had an aunt who was married and who had a lot of children, many of whom are also now novelists and in the writing world. She wrote 52 novels while being a mother. But I think being a literary figure in India, if you were single, you had the time to do it, perhaps. I mean, Shivani, who was my aunt, Shivani, had obviously worked out a better way to do it. But it has to do, I think, with the time and the lack of critical reactions from your immediate family if you've been silent too long, Gwendoline. We need your reaction now on some of this. If you don't want to say anything, it's okay. I'm not giving you Indian mother pressure.
About having children, probably not.
It's also a question of class, of unpaid labour, of privilege.
Yes, exactly.
Virginia Woolf was, didn't have kids. She was also low. It's all manner of different. It doesn't take away from the greatness of their writing. But I consider myself, a daughter of Emily Bronte. She may not have had kids, and not that I can write like her, but her existence is so important to me. It always has been all my life. And so that, I think that the tribute to women writers means a great deal to me. That part of this discussion is very meaningful for me.
I'd love to know who you consider your literary foremother. Sorry to interrupt. I thought you'd finished.
Well, Margaret Drabble, I suppose, who had lots of children, I think. or a few. Sheila Delaney, definitely, who wrote A Taste of Honey, and whose name I stole the name of the mother from Taste of Honey for my book. Had to call her Hen.
Sheila Delaney's archives at the British Library, everybody. I just jumped hats there, sorry. Go on.
Which again, I suppose, has to do with people leaving their families, but in this case, it was sort of leaving the thwarted mother to go south or to go to art school or whatever it is that Jo in Taste of Honey does or doesn't do in the end. Yeah. So those two are definitely up there, I think.
Could we first have the mic there, because he is the only man who's hung around.
I was
Most
about
of
to
the
say,
other men have slunk out very
about to
discreetly
say-
at various points.
I was about to say, if I might inject a lone and slightly nervous male voice into the conversation. So, my name's Wasim Khan. I write crime fiction set in 1950s India, featuring India's first female police detective. I'll be speaking at the Murder They Wrote panel later on. But as part of the research that I do for that, I've come across lots of these incredible female pioneers that we don't really hear about so much. You mentioned the patriarchy today, and I guess, and I'm open to be corrected, but India is still regarded from the outside as a very patriarchal society. And yet we've been talking today about how important women are to families and to the institution of family and society as a whole. So I guess my question is to you, Namita, but also the others might comment on, because you obviously know the area. Is it true today to say that India is still very patriarchal? And if so, what is it that's giving that impression today?
I don't know how the people here would respond, but
as I said, I'm open to
apart
correction.
from that,
Yeah.
I think India is, both India, especially Pakistan, and Nepal also, are societies where women are incredibly strong individually. But socially, they are strong only in small spaces. And in those small spaces, which are usually domestic, then they become stronger and stronger and try to take up more and more space, because they are powerful women, but the places they have to operate their power becomes less. And so they become very manipulative, and turn against their own, the other women, because they are crowded into that space. But this is becoming an alarmingly general conversation, but there's a lot of learnings in it. Yeah, but thank you. Yes, I think it's a matriarchy in spirit, but not in the way the power operates.
Well, if I can briefly step outside of India, you know, all of the gains that have been made by feminism of every shade are now in peril. And it's, you know, from Texas to Kabul, it's the era of the strongman. And yeah, just to name a few, these are just incidents that are globally connected and reinforced by sort of strongman leadership and toxic patriarchy, masculinity, whatever you want to call it. And that to me is a clarion call. That to me suggests the need to return to these themes and to look to the feminist pioneers and to the women that brought us this far, or the campaigners of any stripe that brought us this far and gave us the rights that we enjoy and that we actually take for granted. And to realise that human rights go backwards as well as forwards.
Absolutely. And I also think that when they go backwards, well, clap for that, yeah. But I think when they go backwards, and they have come forward, then often the contradiction arises that the women are feeling very strong, but they are feeling more strangulated than ever, because as they feel strong, the assertions of patriarchy become even more vicious or strong.
I'll just say this quickly, because I've been waiting for some time, is that I've read almost all of your work, Gwendoline.
Gosh, thank you.
And you have a very sort of forensic look at mother-daughter relationships. And I think if you examine mother-daughter relationships as forensically as Gwendoline does, you'll realize that there really isn't much difference between South Asian families, or, you know, there's a kind of a universality to those relationships, I think. And hopefully we'll get another book from you soon.
I would definitely recommend that everybody buys
The lady
Gwendoline's
behind
books.
you wanted to speak a little while ago. Do you still? You would? Or are you hesitant?
I think the discussion slightly left me behind and moved on. But I was going to say...
Nobody's telling us that.
Oh, okay.
I was just going to say that, so I'm a British-born Indian, and visiting India over many years, over decades, things are changing in the joint family system. When I first used to go, well, I grew up in a place where there weren't any Indians, so I didn't really know very much about India or Indians or a joint family system. So it was very much as an outsider that I looked at it when I went first as a young girl. And I thought that once there was a welfare state and women were educated and would go to work, that the whole system would naturally collapse and it would be something of the past. But as I've grown older, I've noticed other things that I think are and just to go back to something somebody over there said about Southern Italians and so on. I think actually the joint family system is not particularly Indian, but the nuclear family system is particularly Northern European and Western Northern, like America and the countries that have followed that pattern is particularly Northern European. Most of the rest of the world does the joint family system in some way or the other. In some way or another. Growing up and seeing India develop over time, the other thing that I've realised that is, in my extended family, I can see it, my very wide extended family.
Could you talk louder? We can't hear.
So, oh really? I always feel I talk too loud. Is people moving for work, sort of an industrialization and people's education taking them to jobs that mean they move cities, and that is necessarily breaking down the system. But on the opposing side, the thing I think that I've noticed that I feel is holding things together in the joint family system is the question of what makes you a grown-up. I realise that in the West, you become respected as a grown-up when you are independent. That seems to be the thing for me that moves you to being a grown-up. Whereas I realised, back in my village, back home, that what made people be seen as a grown-up is when people depended on you. That was your transition to adulthood.
Yes,
and that, I think, is something that is one of the things that will help to hold together family responsibilities and so on.
That's so
duty is not a dirty word. Duty is an adult word.
That is an insight.
The other thing is the sort of the pride and admiration for that way of living it's still continuing. So even in things like Bollywood movies, which I don't watch and don't really understand, the man who respects his mother and father and looks after them, it's a point of admiration. It's a virtue. It's something that has a good light shone upon it and makes you a good person. So it's something that people want to aspire to be.
You wanted to close a comment and then
and my grandmother, for instance, who has now passed, when I realised that in Kerala you can get pension, I said, do you get your pension then, on Mama? And she said, of course not. I have a son. He looks after me. I wouldn't dream of it. So
yes.
The welfare state has different limitations.
It's a very valid thought. What do we do now, Bee?
I think we need to wrap up.
I think
nobody
is making sounds.
I think we should very quickly go to
but how
our
come
closing
nobody is sort of
comments
saying you're running out of time?
We're not getting kicked out, and this is very lovely, but we probably should
I
shuffle
know.
on because there'll be another session
Sounding
coming
to
in.
me as though we should be winding up.
We need to stop now. So, apologies if you haven't got to your final question. I'd like to pick up on the point that you asked. You posited what makes a grown-up. I will counter that with what makes a good person is a person who buys books and reads them. And everything we've addressed today can be found in books. So go and buy books off Viv. That's my closing.
That was a very good closing thing.